Thanks, Chair. I'll just return to the terrorism matters if the relevant officials wish to come forward. Firstly, can I have an update on the National Terrorist Offender Register?
Sorry, Senator, do you mind just repeating?
Yep. Could I please have an update on where we're at with the National Terrorist Offender Register?
That's still under consideration by government, and we're providing advice on that.
By consideration, do you mean consideration whether to proceed or how to proceed or...?
How to proceed, Senator.
Right, so the government is intending on proceeding with a National Terrorist Offender Register?
Well, we're still in the process of providing advice and getting final decisions, Senator.
You answered my previous question by saying that it was about how to proceed, not whether to proceed, so I'm just seeking clarity. The government does intend to establish a terrorist offender register, doesn't it?
I don't think we've had formal decisions, Senator, so
right.
There hasn't been any change of approach, but neither have we provided advice and had decisions on proceeding.
Okay, Minister, can you shed any light whether the government intends to proceed with it?
Happy to provide an update on notice, Senator Patterson.
On notice. This is funded in the March 22 budget. I believe $19.8 million was set aside. That's now some time ago. There's no progress at all.
I think we're doing work on that, Senator, as I said, to provide advice to government.
About establishing it.
Yes.
Has any money been expended on it?
It might be a question for the AFP, but to our understanding, not.
No one's been hired to work?
The funding's been appropriated to the AFP.
Okay, no one's been hired to work on it?
Well, we've been doing work on it, Senator, but the funding for actually managing a register was appropriated to the AFP.
What are the policy considerations before government?
I can't get into that, Senator. It's still advice that we're preparing.
Why can't you get into it?
We haven't prepared advice and given that
I'm
to
not asking you
yet,
for
Senator.
final advice, but you said you're preparing advice to assist the consideration of government. What are the issues? Is it about the design of the scheme? Is it about the size of the scheme? Is it about the operation of the scheme? Is it about its relationship with the states and territories? What are the issues?
I mean, it could be all of those things, Senator. Design, operation.
How about you narrow them down for me? Which ones in particular?
Senator, I just can't add anything more at this stage.
Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to an update to that. Is there any timeline on the advice to government?
No, Senator. We'd be hoping to provide some advice reasonably shortly.
Right. And the government is waiting on the department to provide advice before the government can make a decision about it?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. There are a couple of tools for managing convicted terrorist offenders when their sentences expire. Obviously, there's a continuing detention order or an extended supervision order. For the benefit of the committee, can you outline the process for obtaining a CDO or ESO against a convicted terrorist?
Yes, I'll just get Ms Hartigan to do that.
So, Senator, I'll start with the continuing detention order. So a CDO provides for the continued detention of offenders who pose an unacceptable risk to the community if released at the end of their custodial sentence, where a less restrictive order would not be effective in preventing the unacceptable risk. And for the ESO, it imposes, it's an order that imposes a range of conditions on offenders in the community who pose an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence at the end of their custodial sentence. It's the less restrictive measure to the CDO. So
how are they obtained?
They are made. The attorney must make an application to the court for them.
For both.
For both.
And it's the Attorney General's Department that is responsible for this?
The Attorney General's Department is responsible for the casework in support of what we call the HARTO regime, the High Risk Terrorist Offenders regime.
So you provide advice to the Attorney-General, and the Attorney-General applies to the court, and the court decides whether or not it should be granted or under what circumstances?
That is correct, Senator, and we take inputs from other relevant stakeholders in forming that advice before providing it to the Attorney.
What role does Home Affairs play in the process?
Home Affairs is responsible for the enabling frameworks aspect of the HATO regime. So they look after the state and territory funding arrangements and arrangements with the states and territories generally. They're also responsible for driving the capability in the HATO regime under the CTCC, the Counter-Terrorism Coordination Centre. They have a HATO working group.
Do they have any role, though, in applying for or preparing advice in the process of applying for a CDO or an ESO?
Yeah, they're one of the inputs into our advice to the Attorney. So we have some stakeholder groups that we lead, and Home Affairs are invited to sit in on those groups.
Okay. I have some specific questions about one convicted terrorist offender, Mr. Robert Musa Serantonio. Have any control orders been or any ESOs been placed on him?
No. No ESO, Senator, and as far as I'm aware, no control order.
What was the rationale for the decision not to place any orders on him?
Based on, the decision was based on expert advice that we pull from relevant agencies.
Can you expand on what that means?
For both the ESO and the CDO, we have to make an assessment of the risk of the offender. So both require that there be an unacceptable risk of the offender committing a Part 5.3 offence, a serious Part 5.3 offence. And informing that the view on risk, we obviously work very closely with the AFP, with ASIO, with the relevant state jurisdiction, their police and their corrections.
So the judgment was in this case that he doesn't represent a serious risk of committing another terrorist offence or to the community in other ways?
Ultimately, it was a decision for the Attorney with respect to Mr. Serantonio, but the Department provided advice to the Attorney.
That's what I'm asking about. Was the Department's advice that he didn't represent a serious security threat to the community?
Senator, we don't want to get into the details of operational advice from agencies.
I wouldn't expect you to get into any operational matters, but I'm asking the conclusion that you reached in your advice.
I mean, I think it speaks for itself, Senator, in the fact that orders were
not necessarily.
not
No, it doesn't necessarily follow. It could be that the Department advised one course of action and the Attorney-General took a different course of action.
That's not the case, Senator.
In this instance?
Yes.
So why can't you just say then the advice provided to the Attorney-General was that he represented a low risk or no risk?
I don't want to get into the details of operational advice from agencies, but I can say that the advice was that there wasn't a basis for those orders. Okay,
well, I mean, you've just answered the question. I don't know what the reluctance was. If there's no basis for the orders and if the Attorney-General followed the advice of the Department, then it is your judgment that he represented a low risk or no risk. When there was a bail hearing for one of his co-conspirators in 2016, it was reported on in the Herald Sun at the time, and a judgment was attributed to one of the police involved in the case, Acting Detective Sergeant Adam Foley, who said that Mr. Serantonio was at that time the second or third most influential jihadist preacher in the world. That was 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, but that was a serious assessment of police based on what they were attributed to intelligence at the time. Something obviously very significant has changed between then and now for you to reach the conclusion that he's now a low risk.
Senator, I think as with my earlier answers, it's not appropriate to get into the detail of agency assessments.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on to another matter relating to terrorism, and that is the time taken to list terrorist organisations. You might remember Ms Chidgey, we discussed this in estimates in November last year, and in particular I'm interested in the time it takes for ministerial consideration now that two ministers are involved in the process, both the Minister for Home Affairs and the Attorney-General. Just to remind you of that evidence, I think you said that the two case studies that I provided weren't sufficient to draw the conclusion that the new process was taking longer than the old process. The two case studies I had was a 6-day process for the ministerial consideration component of the terrorist listing under the previous government to a 13-day process under the new government. We now have the benefit of an additional case study, which was the relisting of a number of existing terrorist organisations, which were the Islamic State Sinai Province, Islamic State in Libya, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. On this occasion, it took the time taken for ministerial consideration was 22 days. That seems like, again, a very significant blowout in the time for ministerial consideration. Do you have any comment on that?
Senator, I think what I'd say would be consistent with last time is that all relistings are done within the legislative time frames, so there is no issue there.
Yeah, I did take that point when you made it last time, and I'm not trying to suggest this time either that a terrorist listing has lapsed as a result of this new process, but it is also clear that the time taken is longer than it used to be, and that has flow-on effects. It means that you have to prepare the advice earlier and get it to the ministers earlier to make sure that there isn't a lapse in the listing. And we have gone from 6 days to 13 days in one instance, or from 6 days to 22 days in another instance. That's clearly been caused by the machinery of government changes under the new government, hasn't it?
No, Senator, we haven't ourselves done a comparison of timeframes, but obviously the important thing is that they're relisted in time, which they have been, and I can say that we work very effectively and collaboratively with Home Affairs on listing of terrorist organisations.
I don't doubt that for a second. I'm sure that's the case. But we now have two ministers who need to consider this before it proceeds, rather than just one under the previous arrangements, and so each of these ministers on their own might take an appropriate amount of time to consider a listing, 6-7 days thereabouts, but both of them together blows that time out dramatically, in some cases 4 times longer than previous. There's really nothing else we can attribute that to except the machinery of government changes, is there?
Senator, I don't accept that, and
what do you attribute it to then? Why is it taking longer?
I think it's just irrelevant, Senator. The relistings are made within the legislative timeframes and done as required, and there is simply no issue arising.
Well, whether you think it's relevant or not, Ms Chidgey, is fine. That's your opinion. I do think it's relevant, and I am interested in what you attribute to the longer time that's now taken, given you think it's not the fact that we now have two ministers to make the decision. Why do you think the ministers are taking longer collectively to do so?
We haven't, as I said, done our own comparison of timeframes, but I don't attribute it to anything, Senator. We're working effectively with Department of Home Affairs, and the relistings are done within the required timeframe.
Are there any terrorist listings upcoming?
Yes, Senator. I'll get Ms Hartigan to talk to that.
Senator, I think from last check there are 3 due in the next couple of months.
Can you take me through them?
Islamic State, West Africa Province and Boko Haram.
They're the 3.
They're the 3.
When do their listings expire?
Boko Haram is 1st of July 2023. Islamic State 1st of July 2023. Is it the same for West Africa? Yep, 1st of July 2023 for West Africa as well. Islamic State, West Africa Province.
That's not all that long away. Is the decision from the ministers imminent?
I could say the process is well advanced, Senator.
Because it's now 5 weeks until those listings expire. From my memory, having dealt with a few of these in the previous parliament, I don't think it's come quite that close before to a listing expiring. Normally there's a lot more lead time built in, considering that there's a parliamentary process which has to follow this.
Senator, as I understand it, the process is well advanced, as Ms Chidgey has said. I understand that the attorney has written to the Leader of the Opposition about these ones.
So does that mean that in that timeline that's provided when the listing is made public, that we're past the point for ministerial consideration if the Attorney-General has written to the Leader of the Opposition?
Sorry, Senator, I'm not quite clear on your question.
There is a timeline which is published in the Statement of Reasons when a listing is made, and it sets out the timeline for consideration by government. So I'll give you an example from the Al-Shabaab listing. On the 9th of March 2021, the department commenced coordinating whole of government input, etc., etc. AGS provided advice on this date, etc., etc. Typically, there's a date which the department provides a submission to the Minister for Home Affairs. Then there is approval given by the Minister of Home Affairs. This is in the case of the previous government, but obviously now the Minister for Home Affairs and the Attorney-Generals. And then later on, there's a process where they write to First Ministers, the Leader of the Opposition, etc., etc. I'm taking it from the fact that you say that in this instance, the letter has been written to the Leader of the Opposition, that the ministerial consideration component of that timeline is complete.
That's a fair assumption, yes.
Great.
Senator.
How long did it take?
We'll have to take that on notice, Senator.
Why don't you have that information available?
Because we don't, Senator.
Is it difficult to find? Is it not?
Yes, Senator. We'd need to piece it together from looking back to submissions, etc., and also speak to colleagues at Home Affairs.
Yes.
So, just so I understand that, you said it would have to be pieced together. So you don't already have the draft, for example, of this document of the Statement of Reasons, which includes the dates. That hasn't already been drafted?
The Statement of Reasons has been drafted for those three. Yes, Senator.
Okay. And in that Statement of Reasons, have you started to pencil in the dates for the timeline component of it?
We'll have to take that on notice.
Mr Muffet started to nod there. If you have the answer, you should give it.
We don't have the dates of ministerial submissions.
Sorry, Ms Chidgey.
Senator.
Mr Muffet looked like he was about to answer that question. You cut him off. I would like to hear from him.
Luke Muffet, Assistant Secretary, Security Law and Policy Branch. I was just indicating for that particular letter, we usually fill in those dates at the end. I think this is the letter we usually write to the PJCS Secretariat at the end of the process, and we pencil those dates in as they occur, including the last one, which is when the regulations were made. Okay. So you haven't started put those dates on that document yet? No.
No, and how would you go about putting those dates in those documents? Where do you store those dates before you put them in the document?
We simply look at our records.
They're in our departmental systems, Senator.
You look at your records, and they're not accessible to you here?
No, Senator, we can't get that this evening with any
Ms Chidgey, I'm happy to have answers from Mr Muffet because he looks like he's the person that actually does this task. So I want to give him the opportunity. You don't have access to that system here?
Senator, we're not able to provide
Ms Chidgey, why do you keep answering for Mr Muffet when I'm directing questions to him?
Senator
Why can't he answer the
Patterson.
question? Are you concerned that he'll contradict what you've said?
Oh, Senator Patterson, that's a completely unfair reflection and really
I'm asking a question.
inappropriate. No, but you don't need to comment on the body language and general vibe at the table. Ask your question, direct it to who you want to, and I'm sure they'll answer it.
I've tried to do that, Chair, but you might have observed when I do
take
that.
your time, ask the questions calmly, and you'll get the answers.
Thanks, Chair. I am calm. I've directed it to Mr Muffet and he's not been able to answer because Ms Chidgey has interjected when he's tried to do so.
Can I just clarify, Senator, the date you're after, is that the date of the Minister considering this relisting?
Yes. What I'm seeking to understand is if there is an upcoming terrorism listing, how long has the ministerial consideration taken in this instance? Because then we'll have another data point.
I do not have that date with me in my folder here, and I don't have a computer or anything, so we would have to confirm that.
Okay, I will look forward to that answer on notice. Thank you.